Hi, everyone. And just a quick check. Dr. Kolk, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. All right. So I am just checking to see how many folks are with us on this Zoom line. So we are at 421 and counting. So I just want to start by saying a big welcome to all of you that have made the choice to be with us here today. It feels like such a privilege for us to be able to gather for this conversation. So, technically speaking, Dr. Kolk and I met 2 days ago, but I was telling him when we met that my connection to him and to his monumental scholarship actually dates back over 10 years to when I was in graduate school for social work. So this was many years before he had actually published his seminal best-selling book, The Body Keeps the Score. And it was at a time when actually you were advocating wholeheartedly for developmental trauma disorder to be recognized as a formal diagnosis, so that there was a real framework and language for talking about how young people who experience trauma over time can be best supported. So it feels like a real kind of full circle moment for me, for us to be talking together, and it's a real honor to share this space with you and all of our esteemed guests. So just a little bit about how we are going to proceed. So in a couple of moments, I'll be sharing questions for Dr. Kolk, and Damali and Terrell are going to be monitoring the chat. So as they share, there's going to be some time for open Q&A towards the end. But before we get started, I actually wanted to share a quick grounding and orienting practice for all of us. So, just to recognize that talking about trauma can be risky and activating for all of us, right? And a lot of times it can be pretty intellectualized. We might kind of hang out in the brain and, in the world of thoughts. But I really want us to start by grounding in the body, to give us a little bit of resourcing for this conversation. So before we dive in, the invitation now, this is totally optional, is just to ground first. So what I mean is to tune in to whatever surface you're sitting on and just feel what it's like to be supported by your seat. So maybe you're sitting in a chair, or on a couch, or on the ground, and just noticing the parts of the body that are making contact with the surface underneath you. Or maybe if you're resting your back against a chair, noticing what that feels like. And then orienting for a moment. So the invitation here is actually just to look around your environment using your eyes, your neck, and your hips. So looking all around the space that you're in. Noticing colors, noticing shapes. And making a point of also looking behind you, which is a way of signaling to the nervous system that you kind of know where you are, that your space is safe enough and okay. And then looking for a resource for you in your space. So it could be something that you can hold in your hand. So for me, I have a stress ball. It could be something that you touch. It could be something that you want to look at. But just identifying something in your environment that is either a source of comfort or at least something that's neutral. So that if any time during our conversation you feel like it gets to be a little bit too much, you have some sort of an anchor to the present moment to lend you some support. And if it feels available to you, my last invitation is really just to stay tuned into the body as we go through the conversation. So I know for me, sometimes I joke that I can be just a floating head and I can forget that I have a body. But from time to time, if it feels possible, just see if you can notice what it's feeling like in the body as we're having this conversation. And without further ado, let's jump in. So Dr. van der Kolk, I have several questions for you. And like I said, this is really exciting for me to be able to talk to you after all of these years of really poring over all of your work and scholarship and being in the field of trauma treatment myself. So
It's a pleasure to hear you talk to us in such an embodied way. You know, it's really nice, actually.
I'm glad it feels that way. So I want to jump in. I'm going to read a quick passage from your book. It was really, really interesting to revisit the book. I mean, I have it right here. This is my old copy. I mean, it is many years old. I have Post-its and, all sorts of annotations. But I've been sitting with the book since the pandemic, and certainly since Damali and the wonderful team at Trinity invited me to have this conversation with you and reading it with fresh eyes. And so I wanted to start with this excerpt. You say, "We seem too embarrassed or discouraged to mount a massive effort to help children and adults learn to deal with the fear, rage, and collapse, the predictable consequences of having been traumatized." And so I've been coming back and back and back to this statement as I've been reflecting over what's happened over the last 14 months of being in this pandemic, right? The profound fear and loss and uncertainty and isolation. And so I just wonder, what do you think is most important for us to know about how trauma impacts the brain and the body and the spirit? And maybe you can speak more generally just about some of the impacts on mental health of this pandemic.
I think a lot of what you say resonates with me. Huh? And that is, I think dealing with trauma is most of all being able to face reality. And we have had a horrible time facing reality in this country in the last few years. And people say sometimes, please, Dr. van der Kolk, leave out your political comments. I came to listen to you about trauma, and I go, how can you divorce trauma from the circumstances that people live in, which is political? And so, as a therapist, you can do a little sliver of helping people to regain a sense of stability and to tell the truth. But the larger issue, of course, is the conditions that breed trauma, like unemployment, extreme poverty, raising kids all by yourself, living with a lot of violence all around you, and seeing all the denial of the reality that we have seen in the last 4 years. And that has, we just had a vote yesterday that someone who spoke the truth lost her position. And so being able to tell the truth is really, really important. And the nature of trauma is that it's overwhelming. It's too much. And so you shut down. And so we need to create conditions where people feel safe to face reality and to find the words and find the resonance and people who say, oh my God, that's what happened to you. And to really acknowledge the reality of people's lives. And that, of course, is by and large a social issue, but also is true for therapy. Huh? So a lot of therapists try to fix people from their problems before actually finding out what the problems are. Huh? And we cannot fix anything, really, until we know what gives rise to all this stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, I love how in your book you really acknowledged in particular how, whether it's political figures or sort of like the field of psychiatry really has had this discomfort around talking about social conditions, politics, and trauma. And, full disclosure, I want to be clear that from where I sit, I think that the mental health disciplines have really fallen short when it comes to helping us name and really understand just the full scope of trauma and traumatic experience for folks. And thinking particularly about the moment that we're in right now, right? With not only the coronavirus pandemic, but also the just epidemic racialized violence that we have witnessed
And
or
poverty.
experienced here. I just kind of wonder, how has your understanding of trauma evolved over the 10 plus years since you've written the book?
That's a
And in
long
particular,
story.
this question of racialized trauma, right? Where does that fit in now to the discourse?
I think you're raising a very important question that some people may be very offended by who are listening to this. I oftentimes wonder if psychiatry does more harm than good. Right? That but the way we started off at the beginning is that we created this diagnosis, PTSD. Very nice thing to create. And it was created because America happens to be the most warlike country since Genghis Khan or something. And we have this massive army that's larger than any other country in the world, the next 14 armies in the world. And so people rarely talk about what is with us, that we have this gigantic army against all these enemies who we need to create. And we spent all these resources on the army. But so finally, I was working at the VA with veterans. And of course, when you send people abroad, they really get messed up. They oftentimes are messed up even before the war, because the army is also the place that many people go to escape from poverty and very difficult conditions. So it's all very complex. But when we created the definition, the opening line was, people have experienced an event outside of the normal human experience, way beyond what people ordinarily experience. How out and lounge we were, and that we thought that that this was extraordinary. We didn't know about domestic violence. We didn't know about child abuse. We didn't know about rape. And so initially we thought this is a really rare condition. And then it turned out that many more kids are traumatized at home than their soldiers who are traumatized at the war, which brought up the whole issue of developmental trauma. Because if you get traumatized in your own family, then it really affects how your brain develops itself, how your identity develops itself, and then it becomes really an issue of, well, under what social conditions do you get raised? And so, what for me, from a scientific point of view, was really interesting is how much we learned about how the brain gets formed by experiences, and how you develop a brain that's particularly developed in order to cope with what your environment is as a little kid. So if you're a kid who feels safe and adored and happy, you become curious and you're open. And if you're a kid who feels threatened and unsafe, you become a kid who learns to defend itself and to be careful and to not focus on learning and curiosity, but you focus on, how can I defend myself? How can I be sure that nobody's going to hurt me next? So you get a different brain and a different mind. And so that's really much of what my work has been about. But, my book is done very well, but within psychiatry, I don't think it's made a damn bit of difference. The American Psychiatric Association solidly rejected all our very good research data about developmental trauma, and how when you get abused, neglected, and mistreated as a kid, you will have a hard time making it. And so when people started to calculate it, it became very clear that child abuse and neglect is the most expensive public health issue in America. It's more expensive than cancer or heart disease. But we sort of keep skating around the edges, and we keep calling people oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder, or self-mutilation disorder. All these behaviors are secondary to kids feeling scared and frightened where they live and who they are, which also makes it very hard for them to learn and emerge from that, and to have enough capacity to actually be relaxed and curious and to learn. So early trauma really sets people up for failure. And then you have exceptional people, maybe some of you, who have gone under very adverse circumstances and who miraculously make it out. But basically, if you're just living in fear and terror, it's going to be you're going to have a hard time feeling good about the life you make for yourself. Huh? And so it is an enormously expensive issue to to keep people in poverty and keep people living in violence because we pay such a heavy price for it. It was interesting for me, for example, I grew up in the Netherlands, which has become a very, very nice country since I left. And so when I go to the Netherlands, sometimes I get a call from the Ministry of Health, which they probably do to many people like us, say, could you spend an afternoon with us to sort of talk about the latest findings about trauma? Why? Because they want to make laws and create social conditions so we can prevent that. I don't get calls like that in America.
Mm.
But the product of calls like that, not only to me but many other people, is that the incarceration rate in the Netherlands now is 58 per 100,000. In America, it's over 850 per 100,000. And so if you don't pay attention to this, we all pay a huge price for allowing these conditions to continue. Otherwise, I have no strong opinions about anything.
No, I mean, it's really true. And I mean, I think I'm thinking about your work, and I'm also thinking about the work and writing of Judy Herman. One of your colleagues, in her really powerful book, she talks about one of the dynamics in sort of like the public discourse about trauma is the pronounced discomfort that we have with speaking about the unspeakable, right? That there is sort of like so much more for us to excavate and talk about in terms of how widespread trauma is, how high a level of trauma some people have to navigate in daily life, right? I'm really thinking about a phenomenal clinician and somatic experiencing practitioner, Sage Hayes, who talks about some of the advanced adaptive safety strategies that some folks have developed, in particular folks who have, whether it's because they're in Black bodies, whether they're people of color, whether they're in other marginalized groups, right? This whole idea of having to figure out how to be safe even when you are perpetually unsafe. And so I appreciate that you're really talking about this kind of institutionalized lack of recognition here of just how significant this problem is, right? And I think it's true also of mental health issues, right? Thinking about sort of like the impacts, the tolls of this pandemic on all of us.
No,
So
not
can you
all of
talk?
it. I want to say something about it because I get a lot of questions. How do you deal with the trauma of the pandemic? For me, it wasn't a trauma. It's an inconvenience. I have a nice marriage. I have friends who I can Zoom with. I have a family. I'm not a young person who has to make new friends. I don't have small kids to raise who need to go out of school. So most people I know, privileged people, have been in a minor way inconvenienced, which is completely different if you're a poor person who works in a nursing home, or if you're an ambulance carrier in New York City, or if you're a fast food worker in New York City and you have two kids at home who you need to feed and you have nobody else to take care of your kids. For those people, it became a horrendous event. So, but what the pandemic really showed up is the enormous inequality, not only inequality, because other factors also, when you're a young person, you're not supposed to sit at home behind the screen. You're supposed to go out there and date people, explore things, and make relationships. And so for young people, this is a very, very tough time. And for poor people, it's a very tough time. For people who are not poor, this was like, it's okay, not a big deal. Yeah.
So I talk to us a little bit about, I want to shift back to your book for a moment
Yeah.
and talk a little bit about some of the, I mean, they're referred to as treatments, but really just practices, some of the resources that are available to people who are navigating trauma, navigating really intense life circumstances to support them in healing and accessing wellness. So can you talk a little bit about some of the practices that you outline in the book? And I'm
Well,
thinking in particular about mindfulness and yoga.
you know, one of my really critical moments in my development was that for some reason I was invited to be an advisor to the Truth Commission in South Africa. Um, I didn't contribute to anything, but I learned a lot. And the person who I learned a lot from, of all people, was Bishop Tutu. Huh? Because what happened here, this is a country on the verge of explosion. Huh? People have been horribly oppressed for a long time. And the reason why they started the Truth Commission was not to bring truth and justice to the black people of South Africa. It was to prevent the white people who have been doing the bad things from getting killed. And so the job was, how do you keep people from exploding in rage once you can really face the reality? And so to just try to help people to calm down and to feel safe, to be seen. And I followed him, I went around with him. And what he did, I saw him dancing with people and singing with people and listening to their stories. And I thought, this is a great trauma therapist. Because the first thing he did was when people are really collapsed and miserable, he helps them to sing. He helps them to move together. And singing and moving is what joy is all about. Huh? You feel joy in your body. And the body is completely left out of mental health. But when people in South Africa who had terrible things that happened to them, when they started to move, they came back to life. And when they started to sing, they came back to life. And I come back from South Africa. One of my students has been in Cambodia, where a horrendous thing happened. He shows me a videotape, which is almost the same videotape that I showed in South Africa of people singing and moving together. And so what I really learned from that is that much of trauma is being in sync with each other. But it's a traumatic event, for example, is if you give me a sign that, hey Bessel, you're really embarrassing me right now. I hope you give me some sort of sign. And if I keep embarrassing you, you become more and more upset. But if I pick up, oh, I'm embarrassing her, and I go, oh, I'll change the subject, or I'll do something else, that synchrony is critical. And what trauma is about is that when you cry out to high heavens for somebody to come and help you, and people say, what's wrong with you? Or stop complaining, or you're just a lazy bum, or you're just a stupid, defective person to feel this way. So what makes something traumatic is if nobody is there for you, and nobody hears what's happening. And so I think establishing synchrony is at the core of reestablishing a sense of safety. And so I hang out with attachment researchers, people who work with little babies of regular moms, drug addicted moms, single moms, all kinds of different people. And what you see is from very early on, little babies depend on the synchrony with their caregivers. Somebody who is really there for you to listen to you and to get into rhythm with you together. But if you're by yourself, you need to find other ways of dealing with yourself. And so if you feel desperate and nobody listens to you, you may start cutting yourself, or you may start starving yourself. Or when somebody says, would you like to take some heroin? Most people I know, if you say to them, take some heroin, go like, what, you're crazy. But if you feel really terrible, and I say to you, take a little heroin, you feel better, you'll take that heroin. So people do that stuff in order to solve a problem. And so the things we're supposed to abolish is the very thing that people do in order to cope. So if you don't go to what's underneath it, you really keep working with band-aids. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, I guess one of the things that I keep wondering about hearing you speak is, you know, how much of this sort of excavation, right, of what's happened to us has to happen in the context of like a therapeutic relationship, right? Like me and you, if you were my therapist, versus there being a little bit more comfort and fluency for us to have these conversations in collective ways about the things that happen to us and for people in our communities. So where do you think we kind of need to go from here for us to just be better versed in
It's
this?
really complex, huh? Because like 30 years ago, we knew nothing about treatment. And so we are a very young field, but we have discovered a lot of very useful things. So the useful things that I've been involved is EMDR, a very good treatment for PTSD, um, yoga, body work. Did the first NIH study on that. Uh, Theater, very useful for people to act together, to take on different roles, to see what it feels like to take a different position, to be a member of the team that does something. Neurofeedback, where you can hook your brain up to a computer and you can play computer games with your own brain to calm yourself down. And most recently, psychedelic treatments, which you probably have read about this past week because all these studies are coming out. And these are sensational treatments that really are transformative, among other things. But I'm again impressed that a psychedelic treatment is going to be very expensive. And I'm not sure how soon the insurance companies will cover it. So it's inaccessible when you're poor. Neurofeedback, which is grossly under research, but is extremely helpful. And I'm actually training a team of 17 people right now in my county to become a neurofeedback center. Could be an extraordinarily useful thing for people around the country, but you don't have access to it. Luckily, low yoga people have access to, uh, capoeira people have access to, church choirs people have access to, but most of the things that are helpful are largely outside of the mental health system.
And so, what do we do about that? Right. I mean, I guess I'm thinking about this question of access, right?
Yeah.
And in the work that my organization does, Lineage Project, one of the things that we're thinking about all the time is this question of access and who is it that has access to tools that are affordable or free and portable and easy to use and accessible when we need them. So what do you think it's going to look like for us to kind of move the dial?
See, I think we have different jobs there. I consider it my job, most of all, to show that these seemingly bizarre interventions are helpful. And so I see it as my job to hustle up enough money and research capacities that when you do something as strange as EMDR, which looks ridiculous on the surface, and we say, oh my God, it really worked. And to say, this is worth spending your money on, spending your resources on. So my job is to prove that these treatments work. And I've done it with theater, I've done it with psychedelics, I've done it with neurofeedback, I've done it with yoga, etc. So that's my job. And incidentally, I get to sometimes do something about policy. But the work that I do is I do very much to make it possible for policymakers and advocates like you to go and say, here's the research that proves that this is good investment. But a person can only do that much. So I think by busting my chops, getting money to do a yoga study, yoga for PTSD, that's ridiculous. Now, putting your butt in the air, twisting your body in a pretzel, helpful for PTSD. Most people go, oh my God, this is gone off the deep end again. And what we discovered is that yoga is probably more effective than any medication that you can give for PTSD. But then the next step is how I've not seen a single psychopharmacology clinic become a yoga studio. But my job is to show what works. And then people need to take it from there.
And so I want to hear a little bit more from you about this idea of healing trauma, and what that's really made of, right? So we were talking a little bit at the beginning about PTSD, this idea of something terrible that happened in the past, and now it's back there, and here we are.
Right.
So in your view, what does it mean to heal from trauma? And is that something that requires that trauma is actually in the past tense, right? So what do you say in terms of folks for whom there is ongoing threat and danger, right?
Well, let's start with the first part of the question, which is, they're all complex questions, but so let's start with the relatively simple ones, which is still extremely complex. So we now know, see, but people don't get, and I hear this all the time, even from very distinguished colleagues of mine, they don't understand what trauma is. Trauma is not the event that happens at some point, because that event is over. And what's over is over. You're no longer a 3-year-old kid who's getting molested. But the trauma is how that event continues to live on in your body. And so I say the critical thing is to help people understand, no, it's not about that event, and you need to talk about an event over and over again, but is that as a consequence of that event, you now are scared to be touched. As a consequence of the event, you are overwhelmed with emotions, and other people make you only feel ashamed of yourself. And so how can we help that body to feel safe? How do you feel that body feel calm? And I think with enough resources, just about anybody I know can get better. But you need to rewire that brain. So what does curing trauma consist of? It is being able to live in the present, as you so beautifully started off with us, feel your butt in the chair, what it's like to sit here right now, and the setting sun is coming through my window right now, and it is early spring here in the Berkshires, and I go like, wow, it's beautiful to be here. And I'm not scared and not about to get hit. So the goal of trauma is to say, I'm alive and I'm here, and something terrible happened to me a long time ago, and it was horrible, but I've survived it and I'm here. And I was very little when it happened, or I was a teenager when it happened, but it's no longer happening right now. And for most people, that is, unless you live in poverty and unemployment and under very bad conditions, that's an achievable goal. But then the question is, if there's ongoing trauma, then the question is, how do you create a community that can feel safe? And of course, people try to build communities like this. I studied with Issei Barnwell for a while, who was one of the singers in Sweet Honey in the Rock, who gives music workshops about Black survival. And it's just a beautiful workshop about how people came from Africa, from different countries. They didn't speak each other's language, but they all had rhythms. And they used their rhythms to commune with each other and to make each other feel safe while they were slaves, by getting the rhythms going and the movement going. And then that slowly sort of moved into the Black churches and singing together and moving together, and how critical for healing music and synchrony has been always to this day. Huh? And so that is how people achieve some sort of sense of communal safety, which has to do with doing things together that are not necessarily trauma focused, but have to do with cooking together, eating together, and creating safe spaces for each other. And I think that's really, from a therapeutic point of view, on a social level also how do we create safe spaces? And I imagine that Trinity Church is very interested and very committed to try to be a safe place for people. Huh? And I think that's where you start.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the really beautiful phrase that you shared in the book, right? This idea of creating islands of safety in a chaotic world, right? So I know that you said that, your lane is the clinical one, and sometimes there's a little bit of venturing into just sort of supporting folks and getting into the policy.
Not a little bit, actually a lot, but my primary job is to explore treatments and to really show, yes, this helps,
So I want us just to play for a little bit. I was listening to a talk with Patrice Cullors, who is one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter and an artist. And she kind of talked about the pandemic sort of being like having all of these colors on a palette, right? So there's grief and loss and resilience and resistance and all of these different things on the palette. And the question that we're facing now is, what do we paint, right? So if you were to imagine what do we paint, with
You pay,
all of
yeah.
these colors that we have.
Yeah.
So just how would you hope to reimagine what's possible in terms of the ways that our institutions, kind of just like the public conversation, what are some of the changes that you hope to see to better resource folks that have experienced trauma?
You know, I have a bit of a loose association to what you're saying. And that is, I mentioned in the book also, my main teacher in my training was Elvin Sambrat, who used to tell us, hate makes the world go round. And I see that a lot, that what upsets you also becomes something you hold on to. For example, I'm no fan of the previous president, but I miss him. Why do I miss him? Because he gave me all that. Every day I was really angry and upset. And now I'm not angry and upset anymore. And I miss my being angry and upset. And so one way of dealing with your trauma is to find an enemy and to get really excited about beating that enemy. And I think the challenge is, can you be excited about not hating? Can you be excited about not being terrified? Can you feel fully alive when you're not creating a threat for yourself? And so, can we create safe havens for ourselves that are based on tranquility, and or are we going to miss all that excitement, which plays itself out in politics, of course. Our politics right now is, to a very large degree, determined by hate and not by how do we create safe places for ourselves. And I think that becomes a very important issue. It's important to recognize how we get off on being angry and confrontational with people. And so that's something we need to recognize in ourselves and say, huh, what else can I do besides being angry to energize myself? Honestly, you don't seem to quite agree with what I'm saying.
Well, I think it's complicated, right? I mean, I'm thinking about, in my training and also in the mindfulness world, a lot of times there's this conversation about wanting to help people relax, right? Like that's kind of the goal. When to me, I think it's not always about chilling out and letting things go, right? There is a time and place for the adrenalized body.
Right.
There is a time and place for
Yeah.
that fight and flight reaction
Yeah,
that is actually resilient and restorative. So I think that it's something that we want to kind of make a little bit more complex.
Oh, I love what you're saying.
But
the whole
I don't.
mindfulness issue is interesting because basically the mindfulness world, so it's so skewed towards people mellowing out and becoming peaceful and turning their mind on flowers, etc., etc. It doesn't quite work that way. And I think for one thing, traumatized people have a hell of a time becoming mindful, you know. And so a simple exercise like you did with us at the beginning, when you sit with all that stuff inside of you, the moment you turn off the TV, you turn off all the noise, you meet yourself, and you don't like what you find. Like, John Kabat-Zinn's program was down the road from me from my clinic. I sent a bunch of my patients to his clinic to the mindfulness MBSR, and they couldn't do it because when they became still, all that stuff started to come out. Yeah, and so mindfulness may be quite complicated actually to still that mind. And for traumatized people, it often becomes dissociation rather than true mindfulness. So that's why I chose yoga. Because in yoga or martial arts, you still need to do stuff, and you don't live in the silence of your body. But indeed, the goal of treatment and the goal of life is to become focused and to really stay focused on doing the right thing. And so the tool of mindfulness is to help you to focus more. The tool of neurofeedback, which I do, is people say, oh, this is like Buddhist meditation on steroids. And when I do neurofeedback, I'm more focused and I can work more clearly and I don't get distracted by irrelevant information. But when we look at what happens in the brains of traumatized people, their capacity to filter out invalid information is very damaged. And so it's very hard when you're traumatized to go like, okay, that guy is sort of unpleasant. Oh, that person doesn't seem to respect me, but that's okay. Because your mind is wide open to see danger all the time, and the smallest thing will trigger you off. And so there's a question of how can you become still enough that you observe a person insulting you, but to go, okay, the guy has a problem. I'm not going to kill him or confront him. I just can see that this is an unenlightened person, but not have that person hijack you. When you're traumatized, it's very hard not to let all that stuff come into you.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that feels really valuable about mindfulness practice, right, it's that quality of curiosity. So, and you talk about it also in the book, right, in terms of yoga, right? So, titrated opportunities, right, like little bits and pieces of being able to sort of like tune in and be a bit more curious about what's happening in the system. And maybe it also means kind of like taking a pause and saying, this is enough right now, right? But that idea of kind of like befriending ourselves a little bit more, bit by bit by bit.
But like at my annual conference, which will be actually next week again, end of next week, uh, Tanya Singer, who's done more research on mindfulness than anybody else, discovers that just be mindful is not bad, but be mindful and really know what you're experiencing at that point. And also not only be mindful about yourself, but be mindful about what's happening to you when you meditate. And so actually I enjoy your energy and your questions enormously. And so I'm really curious, who is this person? How does your mind work? How does your mind work differently from my mind? And what Tanya Singer shows is that the greatest benefit of mindfulness is if you go into this interpersonal process where you don't only pay attention to your own mind, but you make it reciprocal and also know what's happening in your mind. Huh? Yeah.
Right, this relational piece,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And I think that there are so many wisdom traditions that really talk about the fact that healing actually happens in community, right? That it's a relational thing, whether the trauma is individual or not,
There's
right?
something
It's a
crazy about America that we talk about people as individuals. We don't exist as individuals. We're the accumulation of our relationships. The moment you and I hang up, you're going to worry about your relationships and who you need to be in touch with and who you need to nurture. I mean, we are profoundly, completely relational people. And we are not very much beyond being relational. That's sort of what we have brains for. That's what we have minds for. It's all about us and other people. Yeah.
indeed. So, I mean, I could spend hours asking you questions, but I don't want to hog all the airtime. So I know that we have some questions also coming in from the chat.
Okay.
So I want to take a quick little look here and then pose a couple of these to you.
Okay.
So one
Maybe
of
you
them
can
that
answer also because you strike me as quite a wise person in your own right. So I'd be curious for both of us to answer some of these questions. Okay.
we
Go
can
for
we
it.
can
Yeah.
we can chat together. So one question that's coming in, which was connecting to something that we were talking about earlier, someone asks, are there interventions being researched or developed that address people who are living with ongoing trauma rather than past trauma?
Um, I don't think specifically that's being researched. I think you could not get research money for a project like this. But of course, there's a lot of people who are doing that, including maybe you in your agency, or Bob Abramowitz, who had me first come to New York every week to work at the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services, where they saw a lot of ongoing trauma. And, yes, there's still something you can do. And that is, like you can work somewhere with a very difficult person who really does nasty things, and you can develop a capacity to go like, okay, that's him. Um, I need to be careful, need to protect myself. I have some friends who see the same thing as I do. And so to learn that what other people do is no reflection of you. Huh? It's a very difficult thing to do, particularly in relationships, because if something goes wrong in relationships, we are such fundamentally loyal people that if you go to the deep end, I feel that I'm responsible for you. And so if you live with somebody who becomes a drunk or a drug addict, it's very hard not to take on responsibility for that person. And I think it requires a great deal of wisdom, which people talk about in Ellen also, to observe that's that person's problem, but it's not my problem. I have to really learn to differentiate from it. I was impressed when I've been to Brazil, which is a very tough country with a lot of unbelievable inequality and trauma and racism. Uh, how many of these young kids practice capoeira? And when I see that, I go, they practice capoeira because being able to feel strong in your body and feel very skilled and knowing that you can defend yourself is a tremendous capacity to have when you live in a very dangerous environment. To have this internal sense of being very good at what you do. Uh, and so, uh, the greatest defense against ongoing trauma is competency. So you become very good at something. And that to some degree gives you a defense against all that stuff that's being done to you.
And I'm thinking about and want to really lift up a fellow trauma clinician and best-selling author, Resmaa Menakem, who wrote the book My Grandmother's Hands. I've done a lot of work with him over the last year and change. And one of the things that he talks about, and granted, this is not a formal diagnosis, but we kind of talked about some of the politics of what gets recognized and what doesn't. But he talks about PPTSD, right? So pervasive and persistent traumatic stress disorder. And one of the things that he really talks about is the importance of a sort of collective process for also, working with trauma that is ongoing, creating a cultural container and really having a community as a resource to support you in working with the individualized experience of trauma, but also to kind of really acknowledge that the things that are happening to you, especially when you're talking about ongoing trauma, may be collective as well. Absolutely. Right. And so even though it's not been formally recognized, I think that there are some really important conversations that are happening about ways to kind of acknowledge what is true, even if it's not being researched in formal ways, right, and published in journal articles to the extent it should be.
And Resmaa, everybody's reading Resmaa's book, of course. So that's these are very important conversations to have. And of course, then the question becomes that we have to really observe ourselves: is that how can we create a safe place ourselves? Huh? So how do we get along with our coworkers? How do we get along with our office mates? How do we get along with the people who organize things? But oftentimes it's difficult and painful to watch is when you have a bunch of very traumatized people who try to do something together, how oftentimes the trauma gets in the way of easy collaboration. And I see that quite a bit. That very, very well-intentioned, smart people, and they just can't negotiate the complexity of other people's opinions, etc., etc. And so we always start at home. Huh? How are we doing in our own community, in our own church, in our own environment, to make that a safe environment? Huh?
So I want to bring another question in from the chat. And this one is, how would you define resilience and its relationship to the brain, body, and spirit?
I, like some other people I know, have some trouble with the word resilience. And that is that everybody is resilient in their own way. So, some people who don't know much about trauma say, well, some people are more vulnerable to trauma than other people. But I have never sat with somebody in my office where I go like, wow, that's weird that you got traumatized by it. My reaction is almost, oh my God, he is still alive. You have only made 5 suicide attempts after this. Like everybody is trying to cope the best way they can. Uh, And some people actually are particularly talented or have particular skills, and they may write great books, or they may become great basketball players, or they may become great therapists. You come across to me as a very well put together person, but I don't know you. No, I don't know what hidden trauma you're dealing with. We don't know that about each other. Huh? And so
Indeed.
when we call somebody resilient, it's because they have an outward appearance that make them look okay. But I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that they're not traumatized. You don't know if somebody is truly resilient until you're married to them.
And I mean, I think experiencing trauma and being resilient aren't mutually exclusive, right? Like folks that have experienced lots of trauma are resilient in all kinds of ways, right? Like you're talking about. It
And
isn't.
I think it's really important. See, in mental health, which is sort of a weird word anyway, people always say, "What's wrong with you?" And I hear people rarely talk about what's right with you. Huh? And when you really see what people have gone through, you go like, "Wow, you have gone through this, and you still are able to be a cashier in a supermarket. That's amazing." Uh, Given where you come from, some people may be resilient beyond our wildest dreams. And as an outsider, you don't know what the burdens are that people are carrying inside. But but a very important thing that I think should be a very important part of our school systems also is not only how is this kid messed up, but what are the special talents that this kid has? What does this kid have going for himself that can sort of be a pathway out? And so if that kid is a good basketball player, let him play basketball. And don't have him do tests all the time because he needs to cultivate the thing that he's good at. We all need to do that. Yeah? And so it's really important to become much more carefully evaluating everybody. Like, okay, okay, you get very angry sometimes and aggressive. Okay, that's one part of you. What else does this kid have? He may also be very generous or thoughtful, or maybe able to write a beautiful essay. So look at the complexity of a whole person.
Mhm, mhm, absolutely. So I'm going to pose one more question from the chat, and then we'll transition. So someone is asking, how do we cope with the trauma from what's happening in our world all over today?
The
Uh,
trauma of the
listening to news and coping with loneliness from the virus.
see that is not a trauma. That is an unpleasant thing, and you can turn off your TV, and you cannot listen to that. You can go for a walk instead. You can. We should all deal with our addiction to the excitement of the crazy political process that we have going right now. And say, no, I'm not going to listen to these crazy people anymore. Right? And so that's not the trauma. The trauma is when you really when you see people die. The trauma is when you get beaten up, when you get raped. Uh, there's a lot of intervening things that make it more difficult, like our news cycles. And I'm really becoming more and more aware of that our addiction to the news and every detail is very bad for us. And that means that we have to put ourselves on a diet. And we need to actually think about, is it okay for the Washington Post to, if nothing is going on, if nobody is completely crazy in Washington, D.C., to go and get the latest bad thing out of Burma or the latest bad thing of Algeria? We don't need to hear all the bad stories of what everybody's doing in the world. And so we are very addicted to that excitement about all the bad things that are happening. And so the question, can we focus on gardening? Can we focus on making music? Can we focus on playing with our kids? And to say, no, you're not allowed in my home today.
So creating a little bit of a boundary for
Not a little bit of
ourselves.
boundary, really creating a boundary. I say, no, I will no more violent movies or no more certain political characters. No, you say all the crazy things, but I don't need to hear all the crazy stuff that you say all the time.
So,
Really create our own lives. Huh? Yeah.
so on that note, and just in light of time, I want to transition to just a final practice for us to regroup, and also maybe just kind of do a bit of discharge from what has been a rich and spirited conversation, and a wide-ranging one, right? That's brought up a lot of different stuff. So before we go to the closing, I just want to invite everybody to tune back in to their seat. So noticing yourself sitting in your chair and just checking to see how it feels in the body right now, right? Compared to starting the conversation, it could be that there's a lot more going on. There could be tension, there could be tightness, there could be energy and tingling, there could be numbness, there could be a lack of sensation, right? But just checking in to see what's happening now. Noticing if there's constriction in your breathing. For me, I'm feeling a little bit of tightness in the chest. And if there's any part of the body that wants to move, giving you a moment just to do what feels like it can introduce a little bit of space, a teeny bit more ease to the body. And looking around your room again. So orienting here in the now. Again, using the eyes and the neck, the hips. Looking for your exits, looking at the windows and doors. And an invitation if there are any last movements that feel like they can help you discharge a little bit of the energy. So Dr. Kolk and I are both doing a little bit of shaking, some light tapping. And passing it over to Damali.